Welcome back to the Training Model Podcast. Thanks again for checking it out. I appreciate it. I think this is episode number 16. And as I said last week, like these podcasts are just going to be a little bit of sort of like what's happening, some updated stuff as I step into actioning this plan that I built out last year. And now that I'm a dad and things are starting to settle and I'm starting to find my routine, just starting to action those things and build that plan out and actually begin to put myself out there again and my ideas, my models, my ways of thinking in order to help other coaches and just whoever wants to learn. Keen lifters, I like to label those types of people as inquisitive lifters. Maybe they're not coaches or allied health pros or anything like that, but they're keen to learn. They want to understand this stuff more and get the most out of their training and their understanding, because I know a lot of people out there have just a good thirst for knowledge. We have a lot of them in our community here. So I know there's an abundance of other ones like that, those inquisitive lifters out there. So today I have just a little bit of a general update. Obviously, we've got the first mentorship kicking off, the first movement mentorship kicking off, which before we go anywhere, like I was just not expecting the response that I have got off that. I think we're up to like 37 coaches and people involved in that, which is crazy. I'm so thankful. Like I feel like I know I've spoken about this a lot and people are probably getting sick of hearing about some of like my mental health struggles over the last few years, but it's good to feel that reward as a response to just starting to do the hard work again, because I think at the very core of the situation that I've been in behind the scenes is just a response of the lack of the amount of actual work I've been doing, and the work that actually moves the needle forward. I've been doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes for strength culture with marketing and stuff, and that's really starting to roll now, which has been awesome. And maybe we can chat about that if anyone's keen. We can explore those ideas more around the marketing-based things that I've been unpacking and learning about ads and all of that. But for my own, again, I kind of like separate myself. I run a business, yes, but I also have these personal aspirations and career aspirations for myself at a personal level. And I've just had that on the side, like back burner. It wasn't even on the back burner. It was just fucking off the stove. It was in the sink. It was in the fucking dishwasher. It just wasn't anywhere. And hasn't been a focus. And I'm thankful that I continued to do really positive things last year to set things up. But now that I have my plan and I have my approach, it's just time to start actioning that with hard work, making good quality content, helping clients again, being more involved at the gym here, and really starting to step back into that personal stuff. So it's been really positive to see the first intake of the mentorship take off how it has, which I was not expecting it. The pre-learning modules have started. I'm going to get this up today. So like you've got until midnight tonight if you want to jump in for this first intake, but it will be closed after tonight. So yeah, I'm so keen. The pre-learning stuff's headed out. I think it's like 2.5 hours worth of content related to just some of the base concepts around human movement. And then obviously over the 6 weeks, we unpack the specific areas of the body, the shoulder, the hip, the pelvis, the rib cage, the foot, the ankle, and all of that. And then the application of that into upper and lower body coaching, and actually helping people. And I think that's another big thing that I have identified over the last couple of years is, as much as I personally really love discussions around principles and models and thinking and framing ideas and how we're actually coming to the ideas or how we're actually coming to the decisions that we're making within coaching and business for that sense. What I've identified is that I was under the assumption that coaches think the way I do. And that is that if I can understand a principle and really like fine tune like what this thing actually means, the application for me becomes very simple. And I can see how these principles are applied across the board in a number of different ways. And I don't think that a lot of people think in the way that I do. So as a response to that, I was very, very principle-based driven with my education, which isn't a bad thing, but I think I let myself down and let a lot of the people that were coming through my ideas and my different streams of education stuff down with the actual application of what the fuck I'm actually talking about when I get on these like very specific rants. Like I've been ranting for 3 or 4 days now about tension, muscular tension, and why it's misunderstood and all of that. But actually, like the application is what matters most. So it is the biggest focus for me right now. Part of the reason why I'm loving working with my intern, James George, is because he asks me specifically, how do you apply this shit? Like we're talking about all this fucking random stuff, but like, where's the application and what does it mean in the gym? And it's been really eye-opening for me to be like, oh, this is a bit of a hole in my education process. So that is the biggest focus for me right now. And that is my Instagram content, that is my YouTube content, and that will eventually lead into my mentorships and courses and the programs that I want to start to put out there. So there's a whole bunch of new things coming up. Well, not new things, it's just better application of the ideas that I've been sort of yelling from a rooftop for the last 5 or 6 years. But it's time for me to step up and actually show what this model can actually do for people and the benefits that it can have. And it's cool to see, and I'm starting to get those responses on socials, like that momentum starting to build. People are asking questions. Obviously, the mentorship has absolutely launched so well, and I think that's just a response for me changing the way I'm communicating what I'm actually trying to present with here. So, again, thank you very much to everyone that's jumped in. I'm so keen to get the first call next week. We dive into, I think it's the shoulder in week 1, and then the hip in week 2. So pretty keen for that. The other thing that I wanted to just update people on is the YouTube channel. So the Training Model YouTube channel, my personal YouTube channel has started. I think we're at like 81 subs. Let's fucking go. But my plan with that is to just post. Obviously, I post the podcast on there. So if you want to watch the podcast and me just talking to a camera, you can watch it there. But also, I want to post more nuanced, I hate that word, but let's say it, nuanced ideas. Am I even saying that right? It sounds like I'm like putting a French spin. Nuanced. I've said it too many times now, but I want to post more nuanced based, more detailed discussions around what I'm trying to sort of educate on with my social content. So the social content is a little bit more bite-sized, very practical driven. Maybe not the stories, I might get on a rant there, but the YouTube channel is where we actually are going to unpack those things, look at the anatomy, look at the base sort of philosophy of my model, but then actually how we apply it. So I think the recent one where I discussed hip internal rotation is probably a really good view of that, like some detailed discussion around anatomy and what's actually happening, but then there's some application towards the back end to help coaches start to apply these concepts with a lifting-based population. So I'm keen for that. So some of the topics that I've covered so far, we did neurodevelopmental positions. So that's just the progression of how a baby begins to manage gravity into walking. So they start on their back, they roll around, they're getting a lot of feedback off the ground. It's easy to manage their center of mass because the base of support is so great. Eventually they get to like kneeling positions, half kneeling, tall kneeling. Then they start grabbing onto things, and these are your standing supported positions within the gym. And then eventually they get to standing variations, and they begin to take their first steps and begin that locomotion process of gait cycle. I think that process is really, really important to understand, because what you'll see is all of your coaching positions are just neurodevelopmental positions. They're down on the ground, prone and supine, they're side lying. Then all of a sudden we get up into like half kneeling and tall kneeling positions, and all of different upper and core based variations within half kneeling and tall kneeling. Then eventually you get to standing supported, where you're holding racks and finding stability from other areas. And then eventually you get to like split stances and B stances and single legs and locomotive based things. Like they're all ultimately, they are just founded within neurodevelopmental progression. So if you want to understand why those positions have different qualities and different coaching applications, we probably need to understand how the industry got to those positions, which is just the neurodevelopmental progression of a baby managing gravity and starting the process of walking. Because ultimately that is That is the interaction of center of mass and base of support and gravity at its truest form. And that's why I harp on gravity so much. You need to understand gravity because the system is always managing gravity first. Like as soon as you stand up, you're managing gravity. As soon as you actually just roll out of bed, and I even made a joke somewhere in one of the courses or one of the pre-learning things, like even just the process of sleeping is management of gravity. The fact that you have a mattress is society has learnt that a mattress is better to manage gravity as you sleep. Otherwise, you're sleeping on hard surfaces and you get pressure point pains and all of that sort of stuff. So you're better off on a mattress. You'll sleep better on a mattress. Mattress and the decision to use a mattress is a gravity management strategy for sleeping in supine and prone-based positions. So everything in life is gravity management first. So if we need to understand what the fuck the system is doing to manage gravity. So that's a really important video and I'd recommend checking that out. We also did intra-abdominal pressure and bracing and sort of the misconception that air in is what we're looking for, which is not what we're looking for with a brace. Air in is the byproduct of setting a strong position to brace in. And the air in is a response of changing the thoracic size, the thoracic cavity size. And the way that we should be doing that is descension of the diaphragm. So there's some discussions around that. We also did movement models, skeleton and versus muscular-based movement models. That's a little bit of just like a zoomed out vantage of how people in the industry frame human movement and why my bias is towards skeleton-based models, where we need to understand relative joint positions before we begin to understand what muscles are actually doing to the joint, because muscle is ultimately reactive. That muscular tension is reactive to your bone position and your joint position and the relative changes of the specific joint. So that's another like a little zoomed out, very principle driven. But if you can understand those models, all of a sudden we can understand where these educators and myself and all the people in the industry are actually coming from when they discuss their ideas. Then we did what is joint stability, because I hate the term stability. I really do. I think that it confuses. It used to confuse me until I realized I don't need that term in my vocabulary. And I went through an example, and we'll go through that example here as well. But like when we think of like a rotator cuff, like people would think that the rotator cuff is to like center the joint, which that's going to be part of its role. Like if we look at the anatomy, and the anatomy leaves clues, like the rotator cuff is the four muscles that attach from the scapula into the humeral head. So just by nature of where those muscles are attaching and crossing the joint, we know that they're going to have really just a very specific direct contribution to how the humeral head is sitting on the glenoid. Like that's what the anatomy tells us. It's not affecting anything else. They're very localized to the humeral head from an insertion standpoint. They also cover all of the directions of the humeral head. So we have the supraspinatus that runs across the top side of the humeral head. We have the subscapularis that runs across the front side of the humeral head. We have the subscap, which runs across the front side. We have the infraspinatus that runs across the backside, and then we have the teres minor that runs kind of like along the bottom side, still backside, but kind of covers the bottom side of that joint. So all four of those rotator cuffs really just hold and control that humeral head. From a muscular first standpoint and a stability-based standpoint, all of a sudden, though, when we start discussing like shoulder rehabilitation or shoulder sort of dysfunction, if you wanted to use that term, the rotator cuff muscles need to quote unquote fire at certain times in order to control the humeral head, or maybe like the lat is dominant, which is then switching off some of those rotator cuffs. And the application of how do we actually improve shoulder function becomes very focused on those particular muscles and strengthening those particular muscles or controlling those particular muscles within a range of motion. And then we end up in this land where we're trying to strengthen rotator cuff. We're doing all this ER and IR in isolation with bands and cables and all of that sort of stuff. Like that direction of trying to view the shoulder function as stability based very quickly just falls apart. And it's fallen apart in research as well. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, as it pertains to the shoulder, like Dr. Jared Powell is somebody that I would recommend learning from. He makes fantastic Instagram-based content. He's also got some online courses, and he's a PhD. He just worries about the shoulder and what shoulder rehab should look like. And all of a sudden, in rehab and in literature and in the evidence, like, we're not seeing this rotator cuff-based strategy, this stability-based strategy, as being quote unquote effective for rehabilitation processes for a number of different sort of pathologies at the shoulder. And it's really fallen apart. And I think that's because ultimately when we head down that route of stability, we end up in this world that doesn't actually create the outcomes that we're looking for. If we take a skeleton-based model of the shoulder and all of the muscles and the things that control the shoulder, and if we zoom out a little bit, all of a sudden we're starting to see that the shoulder function is probably a response to a whole bunch of different things. It could be your overall motor control of how you're expressing and producing and creating and absorbing forces within the upper extremity, which means that we don't need to zoom in on the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is just part of this process of producing and controlling forces and movement. So there's a whole bunch of other things that need to be understood before we actually start to unpack that shoulder in that case. How is the rib cage positioning and our overall technique expression? How is the scapula moving? How is the actual joint itself functioning? How is the arm functioning? What is the overall load on this system? What is the underloaded areas of this system as a response to our movement quality and movement expression? All of a sudden, with a skeleton-based, zoomed out, more sort of like macro view of this system, we can start to look at a whole bunch of different things, because it's never going to be the rotator cuff. Like, I'm just sorry, it's not. Unless you've fucking damaged one of them. But even still, even if you tear one of your rotator cuffs, and this is the supraspinatus tendon, especially with like the whole impingement-based idea for rehabilitation there, which ultimately, like, the idea of impingement, which is just false, is that you're like running out of space on the the top side of the humeral head and the bottom side of the acromion process, and that space gets impinged by the bones, and then ultimately we start to degrade the tendon of the supraspinatus, and then all of a sudden we start to see degeneration, and we might actually start to see tears. Even that case, like, and again, the research, if you follow Jared Powell, like, that's actually not what's happening in a recovery process. And more often than not, it's just age-related degeneration of that tendon over time. It's not anything to do with the available space that's underneath the acromion. It doesn't matter about how the acromion is shaped or anything like that. Like, it's the total amount of load that is just going through the entire upper extremity, how that load's distributed and where it's all going, which all of a sudden, skeleton first, it's the quality of all of the entire area, upper extremity, that is contributing to whatever the presentation is. So, the stability idea, I'm just not a big fan of it. From a joint position and joint specific stability. Where I am a fan of stability, and that is the actual term of stability for human movement, is stability of the entire system relative to gravity and the base of support. And you can just Google this. If you Google what is stability, let's just say human movement stability, what you're actually going to end up is it's balance. That's what stability is. It's balance of the system. So it's gravity's impact on the center of mass relative to the base of support. And when the system is destabilized, it means that the center of mass is moving away from the base of support with enough momentum that causes a response of the system to restabilize itself. And that is going to look like an adjustment in global positions of the joint. So I call these orientation changes. Or it's going to be a response of shifting your base of support. So maybe that's grabbing onto something, so you pick up the base of support of that object. If you grab onto a table when you're losing balance, all of a sudden you can refine balance and restabilize because you've picked up the base of support of the table. Or maybe it's you're moving your leg position in order to restabilize the system, to shift the base of support underneath the center of mass. So that is, I think, the most important thing when we discuss stability. So you will hear me talk about stability, but I'm going to talk about it in the term of what the definition actually is. Like, we can get into semantics land around things. And I love fucking semantics. Like I'll have an argument, semantic based argument with someone just for the principle of my arrogant, very hard fucking focus on things, like whatever that is. I think it's some of that autistic trait of mine, or those autistic traits. But like, I want to make sure we're defining the terms that we're actually arguing and discussing about, because it is important, because it confuses yourself as a coach, but it also confuses your application and how you educate clients and stuff around that. So it's really important that we have the right terms and that we're using the right terms, and stability is one of them. Joint stability just makes no fucking sense when you actually get into it. You can also then go into like antagonistic activation, which is like the co-contraction side of things. But ultimately, like I don't think that is what I don't think we're discussing joint stability in that sense. We're again discussing motor control and how the entire system is managing tension to achieve the tasks in front of you. Again, that is motor control. So when we start to discuss like co-contractions and antagonistic tension and all of that sort of stuff, that is a motor control response. It is not a stability-based idea at the joint itself. It's how is the system managing the overall tension and forces that are being applied by the system, but also being absorbed by the system and gravity's influence. And then it's your skill and your expression of movement as a response to those forces, both internal and external forces. That is motor control. We can have a good discussion about motor control and managing and improving skill expression and all of that. Again, we're never going to be using that idea around stability from a joint perspective. So, the final video a bit of a sidetrack, but the final video that I discussed was hip internal rotation. I just made a post then before this episode recording, but hip IR is really important. It's really important to understand that it's driven not only by the femur and the relative femoral position within the pelvis or within the acetabulum, but it's really important to understand that it's also pelvic driver distributing sort of positional changes around the femur. So one of my key concepts, and this is in the mentorship, is understanding that human movement expression and range of motion expression is driven by both the distal structure and the proximal structure. And when we discuss unilateral based training application, we actually probably want to understand that proximal structure more, which in this case is the pelvis. When we go down to the foot, we're actually it's more important to focus on the shin position rather than the foot itself, because the shin is driving relative changes at the foot, more so than the foot is driving relative changes at the shin. Same at the pelvis. The pelvis is driving relative changes at the femur, more so than the femur changing its position in space. It's the center of mass that's rolling around, contributing to that range of motion. So hip internal rotation was another video that I chucked on there. Now that we're through the YouTube channel, as I said, please go and subscribe. And if you find that content useful and the direction that I'm heading with it, let me know, please. Drop a comment. Obviously subscribe, help me with that, but just drop a comment and just be like, man, this was really helpful. Or, hey, man, you confused the fuck out of me. Like, I need feedback from the community so that I can actually fine tune my direction. Because again, wrapping back to the very start of this podcast, practical application is my number one priority right now. I want to teach people how to apply these concepts within the gym and under load and in strength training. That's my end goal here. So if it's not practical enough, or if we need more context, let me know. I want to help. Please, some feedback on that. Shoot me an Instagram DM or share it on socials. That's another big thing. Please share my content on social. If you do find it helpful, get it out there, because I want to grow this thing. And I know how helpful this stuff can be for young coaches and people looking to learn this sort of stuff. So please check out the YouTube channel. It's just Jamie Smith training model. If you Google any of that, it should come up. Hopefully I'm starting to get in the algorithm there. The initial videos I've been pretty happy with the response. So really good. So thank you for that. Finally, one of the questions that I got on my Instagram yesterday was related to who the biggest influences of my philosophy are, my training philosophy and my training model. And two names jumped out straight away, which is Cressy and Woodford, and we'll unpack those. But then I also have two continued education courses that I have unpacked and gone through in a pretty detailed level that I think fundamentally changed the way that I view my approaches. I don't subscribe to those two continued education platforms anymore. So one is PRI, Postural Restoration Institute. The other one is the SFMA, the Selective Functional Movement Assessment, which is actually like the smaller brother of the FMS. So if you've ever been exposed to FMS, the SFMA is like the smaller, it's not as publicly known. It's very much rehab focused. But I think fundamentally has way better understanding of principle application than the FMS ever will and ever did. And FMS is a bit of a joke. But the SFMA, I think the principles that they teach are really important to understand. And we'll go through each of these. But the first two people that were most influential on my just overview of training and movement and coaching and all of that. Number one is Eric Cressy. And I think the biggest thing that I learned, well, the two things that I learned from Eric Cressy, the first one from a hard skills perspective is I actually think he was probably one of the initial people that started to really fine tune what I would call functional anatomy. And that is taking anatomy off these 2D representations of textbooks and actually starting to view human movement and anatomy-based principles within the gym and within S&C-based practice. And if you've ever gone through his old blogs, he has a lot of the upper extremity, the shoulder, particular muscles around the shoulder and how they work and connect and contribute to movement. I think he is I put him down as one of the original thought leaders in that space. And I used to just love reading his blogs and all of that sort of stuff. So I think my general overview of functional anatomy, quote unquote functional anatomy, I think was influenced and inspired by Eric Cressy above everyone else. Once I learned his way of framing things, and then obviously I went and did the internship there, which was fundamental to where I'm at now in my career. But like that was the biggest thing, I think. And I think that is still the fundamental foundation of how I view and how I coach and how I view movement. Because ultimately that is what we do as coaches. Movement is the vessel to see change, to see objective change within clients. We layer on the psychology of like program design and all of that on top of the general specificity that is required from a movement perspective. If somebody wants to load and build their glutes, you need movement understanding and anatomy-based understanding in order to program effectively off that. Like movement is the vessel. We just package and wrap it around different strategies and coaching and programming strategies for clients. And I think Eric was incredibly influential in me understanding just movement and what we're actually talking about with movement. So that would be, I think, the biggest influence for me. The second one would be Woodford. So Woodford obviously has the gym around from us here at Strength Culture, but I luckily just grew up in the area, and it's probably 5 minutes from my house where I was living at that point. I spent so much fucking time there with him, with John Paul Cowkey, with Jared Kay, with Jay Ellis, Nick Russell, like all these coaches that sort of came up through the Woodford system. I was in and around that in the very initial start. And the thing I took most from Woodford was systemizing your coaching process. And ultimately that became my understanding of a model. Woodford has his own model and he sticks to his own model, and he modifies and updates it over time with new information and new practice and all of that. But ultimately all of his decisions are coming from a framework. For him, it's around the nervous system, the central nervous system, and that process of like the neural innovation of muscles and coordination and all of that sort of stuff. Like force velocity and those sort of concepts are founded within his model. But when I was there and observing and absorbing information from those coaches that were working for him at that point in time, that was the biggest thing I learned there. Was every time I'd ask a question or a client would present or an athlete would present with something, they always had this framework to come back to help them make that decision. And ultimately, that was their training model, the Woodford model of coaching. And I think that was my first example of, until I got to Cressy, the actual internship, but that was my first example of, holy shit, like if you've got a really foundational core pillar or a couple of core pillars that you can come back to, all of a sudden decision making is so easy for coaches. And you can have other coaches that use that same model in order to create very similar outcomes through which Woodford would have come up with. And that's ultimately where you get staff development and education processes and all of that. Like that stuff was founded with a model-based understanding that I learned from Woodford. Not that I used the same model as him, not in any way, but the idea of having those core pillars is really important. So definitely Woodford as a massive influence for my overall training philosophy. And then finally, we get to the 2 continued education courses. So I'm going to unpack PRI first, because PRI had a very hot moment in the industry just before COVID hit. PRI was huge. Everyone was wondering about it. Everyone was talking about gait cycle. Everyone was worried about respiration and compression and expansion. Bill Hartman was pushing a lot of that at that time as well. And Bill Hartman is someone else that we could probably talk about here. But before, and I don't know, at some point I'll probably chat to Bill a little bit about his model and where he got to and all of that. Like I'd love to go do the intensive at some point. Whether or not I can make it work, it wouldn't, I don't know. But although he's got some new content now that's really good, I'd recommend checking out Bill's current content. But when I met Bill Hartman in 2016, I spent 10 days at the iFast gym. Bill and Mike were incredibly open. Obviously, I was coming off Cressy, and I think Eric had spoken to Mike that I was coming to town for 10 days and to help me out because I'm from Australia and I'm just sort of like learning and all of that sort of stuff, which I'm forever thankful for. But in that process of spending 10 days at iFast, I got to sit in on a bunch of like their in services with coaches and clients and stuff. And I got an assessment there with Lance Goik, who I don't think works there anymore, but he's another fantastic brain in the industry. But I got a first-hand view of what was going on there, and it was very PRI driven at that point. I think Bill had just started to unwrap his ideas and start to move in the direction that he's obviously headed down now, but it was still at that point very driven from a PRI perspective. And that was kind of my like first full exposure of those systems and strategies. And then obviously that's when I was doing the online courses for PRI, but it was cool to see how that went. But fundamentally, what I think PRI taught me, the most important thing that PRI taught me was relative motion. So the idea that joints, the specific joint movement and the two bones interacting with each other is what is actually tensioning muscles. It's not the global position of the joints. It is the specific rolling and moving of joint surfaces on each other. And that is the whole idea of relative motion. So if you've heard this idea, or if you've heard that term in the industry, like what is relative motion? That is what we're talking about. We're talking about the relative changes at the joint level. So if we think about the pelvis, relative IR is the pelvis rolling around the femur or the femur rolling around inside the pelvis. That is what internal rotation. There's two drivers. That's that driver idea, proximal and distal structures. But ultimately, the speed of the joints moving matters, but also the direction that those joints are moving matter as well for what the relative expression of the joint position is in space and what muscles are actually under load and under tension as a response to those relative changes. The example for speed and direction that I get is that butt wink example. We run out of actual hip flexion and we get deeper, but we don't get deeper by the relative change within the hip. We get deeper by an orientational change that happens above the level of the pelvis at the rib cage and the spine and the center of mass. And the whole system rolls back in order to achieve depth. And then it comes back up and re-extends, and then eventually the hip extends. In that process, we got deeper, but there was no relative change that happened at the hip level. So all of the hip extensors and all of the hip flexors and the IRs and the ERs and the abductions and the adductions never actually changed their relative length in space. They may have changed their load because gravity is influencing the hip differently because we've changed the orientation of the system, but they never changed length throughout that process. The length change happened above the level of the pelvis, at the rib cage and the spine and all of the tissues that change length in that sense. So relative motion was huge, and that fundamentally for me came from PRI. And then you get into like the proximal and distal drivers of motion and all of that. That is, for me, it's all PRI. And I think a lot of people in the industry that have those concepts, they are all PRI based as well. Like PRI for years there was the predominant functional movement sort of education system. So, and I've got a podcast on PRI. So if you want to learn more about that, like the idea of that is that you don't use PRI. PRI taught me principles to better understand human movement, but I'm just applying those principles within my application. And I think this is one of the things with these continued education courses that fundamentally just break down, is that people begin to quote unquote use them. That's not how you should go out learning. When you go out and learn from people, when you come to my mentorships or my courses, you're trying to learn how I think. That is the end goal. If you can learn how I think, all of a sudden you can use my thinking and what I teach in the way in which I recommend you think to problem solve for yourself. Otherwise, it turns very quickly into these algorithmic sort of strategies around coaching, which is, I'm witnessing this, I should use this drill, rather than this is happening. Why is it happening? What are the strategies that I could do to improve it happening? And then what are the available strategies that I could then apply to change those outcomes? That is a better way to actually learn information. Learn the principles, see some of the application, but actually go and apply it yourself. Don't just use the cheat sheet of, if this is presenting, then this is the answer, and then this is the answer. And I think that is a huge breakdown. And there are a couple of people in my space within human movement education that use those algorithmic based strategies for coaching, and it pisses me off. A classic one is that if you're struggling with hip flexion at 90 degrees, it is this drill that will change the representation. Bow, bow, wrong strategy, algorithmic based, incorrect. I hate it. What you're better off understanding is, why is the hip moving in that way? What's happening to the system? What are the many different strategies that I can use to change this presentation and this expression to get a better outcome? If you can understand that, opens up your vantage, opens up your world, and you can actually start to unpack and move in a direction where you're actually thinking as a coach, rather than just regurgitating the same fucking shit that other people have learned from wherever it ended up. And I know there's going to be a few people that are aware of sort of the stream that I'm talking about here, but PRI was huge for that. The other thing from PRI, at the core of PRI, you're understanding gait cycle and you're understanding respiration. So anyone and any place in the industry that really hammers gait cycle and respiration, I think a lot of those ideas stem from the PRI-based education stuff. And that was huge for me. If I wanted to take gait cycle further, and actually where I would recommend you learn gait cycle from, it is Gary Ward. I've spoken about him this week on Instagram, but Gary Ward's gait cycle online courses are the #1 based anatomy education materials out there on the webs, on the fucking web, on the World Wide Web. If you want to learn more about that, Gary Ward, he was also incredibly influential, but it came a bit later with my understanding. And I already had kind of built my model, and it kind of just supported and confirmed a lot of the ideas that I already had, which was cool because that felt really good when I went through his courses. I was like, holy shit, there is so much commonality with how he educates and his base. He calls them the big rules, but also my key principles of human movement. That was really like, it was affirming for me to see that, which was cool. For respiration, that was PRI, this whole idea of like respiration and the influence on the nervous system of respiration. And I like to think of respiration as a portal into the nervous system. We can modify breath tempos and speeds and modify carbon dioxide within the blood. And all of a sudden we can very quickly change central nervous system sort of tone. A lot of that came from PRI and the drills and the processes that I learned there. The other big thing, because of gait cycle, was just center of mass understanding. So PRI for me was the start of, holy shit, this whole thing is just gravity. That is all we're talking about here. It's gravity's influence on the system, the center of mass and base of support, and then it's muscular tension as a response to where gravity is impacting the system, where those external forces are coming into the system. Hence why my movement model, I've now framed it as the gravity first movement model, because it's all just gravity. No matter what level we get into this thing, it's gravity. It's gravity and motor control. That's literally it. It's gravity, motor control, and then forced expression, which is just still motor control, but force expression can be muscle size, it can be muscle coordination, it can be central nervous system input, it can be a whole bunch of different things, but ultimately it's gravity management and then motor control processes. And I'm just going to keep singing that from the hills. It's nothing else. We do nothing else from rehab, nothing else from coaching, nothing else from performance. It is all just gravity management. How are the loads being absorbed? And then motor control, how is force being expressed? That is it. It's just gravity and motor control. They're the two biggest things that everyone's skirting around in the industry, or at least this is my belief. Everyone's just skirting around those two core ideas. People are labeling them as certain things, trying to, for whatever reason, but ultimately it's gravity management, it's external force on the system, and then it's internal force application and expression, which is motor control. So gravity and motor control, the two biggest things from what I'm trying to now educate around my model. The final thing that was a huge influence for myself is SFMA, so Selective Functional Movement Assessment. Again, this is like the side piece to the FMS. The FMS is fucking shit. I now view the SFMA as pretty crap too. However, when you go in with a principle-based sort of thirst, you pick up some very key things that make a shit ton of sense in a lot of application. And for the SFMA, it is a motor control strategy. That is what SFMA is at its core. There's a few key pieces early on trying to like break down the ranges of motion at particular joints. A lot of my pattern ideas of flexion, abduction, external rotation, and adduction, internal rotation and extension came from my understanding from SFMA. It also came from PRI, and it also came from Eric Cressy. But those two sort of global extremity or appendicular skeleton positional pieces of human movement, a lot of it was reaffirmed when I got to the SFMA based level 1, level 2 stuff. So that was really good and really important to understand, and a key piece I think for most people to understand within human movement. But then also, once you get past that, you actually end up with the SFMA becoming just a very good framework for motor control expression, movement expression within a motor control lens. A lot of the neurodevelopmental stuff was very heavily influenced by the SFMA. They have a 4x4 matrix of the spine position. So they have supported, let's see if I can remember this, supported, stacked, suspended, and then standing. So those positions are relative to the spine. So supported is down on the ground where the spine is actually on the floor. So neurodevelopmental positions down on the ground, it's supine and prone positions. Then you get to stacked, which is your kneeling and half kneeling variations where the spine is stacked on top of the pelvis. Neurodevelopmental positions is what they're actually talking about here. Then you get to, suspended. Suspended is second. So supported on the ground, suspended is second. So this is all of your quadruped positions and motor control expression within quadruped positions. Again, neurodevelopmental progression. Then we have stacked, which is stacked on top of the pelvis, which is all of your half kneeling and tall kneeling progressions. And then standing, which is now we're elevated our center of mass and minimized our base of support. And we're actually standing and walking around now. Again, what are they actually fucking talking about? They're just talking about neurodevelopmental positions. They're talking about gravity management relative to the size of the base of support and how high that center of mass is within the system. Is it down close to the ground where base of support relatively is way bigger because the center of mass is so much closer to it? Or is it elevated where small, subtle shifts of the center of mass make a huge influence on the system's ability to stabilize and create reactive tension within the muscular system and express motor control secondary to that. So that would be one of the other big things that I learned in my journeys, and the biggest things that have influenced my overall system and strategy for both application with helping clients and helping members here at Strength Culture, but also education around these sort of concepts. So yeah, that's it. That was a big ramble, 45 minutes. Hopefully there's some stuff in there that you can go and learn from and explore. Please check out the YouTube channel. I'd love to see more people getting around that content. If you find it interesting, please let me know, drop a comment. Also, if you made it to the end here and you found some value in this, please share the episode. I would love the support. It does G me the fuck up when I get a little tag and somebody reaching out saying, man, that was really good. So I need your feedback to know that I'm on the right path with this new direction of content. So let's work with this together in the team meeting. And then finally, the intake 1 of the movement mentorship closes tonight at midnight. So if you are keen, jump in. We'll see you at some point. Might do an episode next week to wrap up week 1 of the mentorship. But yeah, hopefully see you around.